There is a cruelty crueler than any blow. It is the laughter of a man who believes you cannot hear him, the careless laughter of someone dismantling your worth to amuse his friends. When the Duke of Corvain agreed to marry the banker's plain daughter to save his crumbling name, he thought her a convenience to be spent and forgotten. So after the ball, he told his friends precisely what he thought of her. He never knew she stood just beyond the door. He never knew she had heard every word. Sidonie Callard had learned very young that a quiet woman is presumed to be a simple one, and she had never once corrected the error. It was, she had found, the most useful thing she owned. People said a great many things in front of a girl they had decided was dull, and Sidonie had spent her whole life listening and remembering and saying nothing at all. She sat now in the narrow carriage that carried her through the wet, gray streets toward the house of Lord and Lady Vauncey, and she kept her gloved hands folded in her lap so that no one might see how tightly they were clasped. She was 23 years old. Her gown was a good gown, sea-green silk chosen with care, and yet she wore it the way a soldier wears a borrowed coat, aware in every moment that it did not truly belong to her. Beside her, filling the whole of the opposite seat with his heavy black wool and his heavier silence, sat her guardian, Mr. Hollis Crail. "You will smile tonight," Crail said, without looking at her. "You will smile, and you will be grateful, and you will say very little. A duke does not wish to be lectured on interest tables by the girl he is generous enough to raise up." "No, Mr. Crail," she said. "Your late father, God rest him, filled your head with figures no husband will thank you for. A woman's accounts are her needle and her thread. Remember it." Sidonie looked out at the rain and said nothing, because she had learned that too. But under the fine kid leather of her glove, the fingers of her right hand moved in the old secret way, counting. She had been counting since she was 6 years old, seated on a tall stool in her father's counting house, while he slid coins across the felt and murmured, "Clever girl, clever girl." Her father had taught her the whole architecture of money, the way it moved and hid and multiplied, and he had told her once, very seriously, that she had the finest head for figures he had ever known, better than any clerk he had hired in 30 years. He had meant to make her his heir in every way but the name over the door. Then he had died of a fever in the space of a single week, and the whole of that bright, ordered world had been folded up and carried away from her and given into the keeping of the man who now sat across from her telling her to smile. She was to be married. She had been informed of it, not asked. The Duke of Corvain, a name so old and so grand that the mere sound of it had made her aunt press a hand to her heart, had offered for her, and Mr. Crail had accepted on her behalf before she had so much as seen the man's face. It had struck her as strange from the very first, so strange that she had lain awake over it night after night. Dukes did not marry the daughters of dead bankers. Dukes married the daughters of other dukes, girls with titles stitched into their christening gowns. There was a reason hidden inside this arrangement, folded up small and pushed down deep, and Sidonie did not yet know what it was, only that it existed. The way she could look at a column of figures and know, before she had checked a single sum, that somewhere in it a lie was waiting to be found. For she had made a study of Hollis Crail over 3 long years, the way another girl might have made a study of music or of French. She had learned to read the small tightenings at the corners of his mouth, the particular smoothness that came into his voice when he lied, the way his glance slid always to the strong box in the corner of the study whenever the talk turned, however idly, to her father's affairs. She had learned other things in 3 years of studying the man across from her. She had learned that Crail grew most gracious when he was most afraid, and that he had been very gracious indeed since the Duke's offer arrived. He was afraid of something. She meant to know what. The carriage slowed. Through the streaming glass she could see the Vauncey house ablaze with light, every window gold, the sound of violins spilling out into the rain like something precious being wasted. "Remember what you are," Crail said quietly, as a footman opened the door. "And remember what you are not." Sidonie gathered her mother's ivory fan into her hand, the one small thing in all the world that was truly hers. Its lowest stick cracked and mended long ago with a thread of silk, and she stepped down into the light. She did not yet know that before this night was over she would hear the reason for everything, spoken aloud in a man's laughing voice, and that nothing afterward would ever frighten her in quite the same way again. The ballroom of the Vauncey house was a long gallery of mirrors and candle heat, and Sidonie understood within the first minute of entering it that she was not welcome here, only tolerated, and only because of the man whose name was now fixed to hers. She felt it in the way the conversations closed as she passed, the small pause and the smaller smile, the eyes that traveled from the hem of her gown up to her face and back down again, pricing her like a length of cloth on a merchant's table. A cluster of young women near the great fireplace looked at her, and then looked at one another, and one of them said something behind her fan that made the others laugh, softly, the way water laughs over stones. Sidonie kept her chin level and her step even. She had crossed rooms far colder than this one. 3 years in Creel's house had taught her how to walk through a place that despised her without giving it the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "The Callard girl," she heard, not meant for her ears, though the speaker scarcely troubled to lower her voice. "The banker's daughter. They say Corvain is to have her. He must be more desperate than anyone knew." She did not turn her head, but she filed the sentence away, whole and complete, in the same cool place where she kept everything, and she turned it over as she walked. There it was again, that word. Desperate. A duke did not need to be desperate. A duke was the least desperate creature in all of England, a man with a name that opened every door in the kingdom. And yet the word kept finding its way to him, from mouths that had no reason to lie. A woman of perhaps 50 years detached herself from the crowd and came toward Sidonie with the fixed brightness of a hostess performing a duty she did not relish. This was Lady Vauncey herself, jeweled at the throat and wrists, gracious and entirely insincere. "Miss Callard, how very brave of you to come. We are all so terribly curious." Lady Vauncey's smile did not reach her eyes, which moved over Sidonie with frank assessment. "The Duke is here, of course, somewhere. Though I confess I have never in my life seen a bridegroom who arrives at a ball and then vanishes to the card tables with Lord Carow for the whole of the evening. One does hope that is not an omen." She laughed lightly, delighted with the little knife she had slipped between the words. "But then, some matches are made for love, and some are made for other reasons, and it is not for the rest of us to say which, is it?" "No," Sidonie agreed, pleasantly and without a flicker. "It is not." Something in the flat evenness of the reply made Lady Vauncey blink, as though she had expected to draw blood and struck only glass. She recovered her smile and moved on to easier prey. Sidonie stood a long moment at the edge of the room, a still green figure among all that fluttering color, and she let herself understand the exact shape of the trap she stood in. She was to be displayed here tonight so that society might look its fill at her, this odd little banker's daughter, and grow accustomed to the strangeness of her before the wedding made her real. She was the evening's entertainment, a curiosity brought out on a tray. And somewhere in these gilded, mirrored rooms was the man to whom she was to belong for the rest of her natural life. A man who could not trouble himself even to find her, to stand at her side, to lend her the plain shelter of his arm for a single hour of her ordeal. The heat and the noise and the perfume pressed on her until she felt she could not draw a full breath inside it. She turned and slipped through a side door into a corridor beyond, cooler and dim and blessedly quiet, meaning only to stand a moment out of the crush and gather herself, to press the cracked stick of her mother's fan against her lips, and remind herself that she had survived a great deal worse than the whispers of women in silk, and that she would survive this too. It was then that she heard the voices. They came from a small room a little way along the corridor, a card room by the sound of it, its door standing open a mere hand's width, and warm lamplight fell in a thin gold bar across the boards at her feet. Men's voices, easy and low and loosened with wine and winnings. She would have walked past. She had every intention in the world of walking past, of going back to the noise and the heat and enduring what was left of the night. Then one of them spoke her name. Not Miss Callard. Her father's name, the name that hung on the painted board above the counting-house door on Threadneedle Street. "The Callard fortune," the voice said, rich and warm with amusement. That is the whole of her charm, Caro, and you know it as well as I do. Sidoni stopped in the dark of the corridor, as though she had walked full into a pane of glass. She knew whose voice it was before she understood how she knew it. Some certainty deeper than thought told her. It was a voice she had heard exactly once before, 3 days past, when the Duke of Corvain had come to Mr. Crail's house to be introduced to the woman he had already agreed to marry. He had bowed over her hand for the length of a single breath, spoken 4 cold words she could no longer even remember, and taken his leave inside the quarter hour. She had thought him merely proud that day. She had not known the half of what he was. Now that same voice went on, warm and careless, and wholly unaware of the woman standing frozen in the corridor a few feet beyond the door. "Come, do not look so grim about the business," said a second man, whom she took by his lazy drawl to be Lord Caro. "She is not so very dreadful from what little I saw. Plain, I grant you. Plain." The Duke let the word out on a laugh, and the laugh was the worst of all of it, low and genuine and shared. The easy laughter of a man entirely at his ease among old friends. "Plain is a kindness, Caro. She has the face of a girl who has spent her whole life adding sums in a back room, which is precisely what she is and nothing more. There is nothing else in her. No wit, no music, no art, no conversation. She said perhaps a dozen words to me across a whole quarter hour, and every one of them dull as a wet Sunday. If I did not need the money, I would not cross a street to be introduced to the creature, let alone walk her to an altar." A third voice, lighter, which she would later learn belonged to Mr. Soodley, spoke through a laugh. "And do you? Need it so very badly as all that?" "I need it," the Duke said, and now the laughter thinned out of his voice and left something flat and tired lying underneath it. "Or I lose Corvain. The house, the land, the tenants, the name, the whole of it, down to the last cracked roof tile. My brother left me a mountain of debt dressed up in ribbons and called it an inheritance, and there is not one respectable family in England that will marry a daughter to a drowning man. But a banker's coffer has no pride to wound. Old Crail came to me near enough upon his knees, so very eager to be rid of the girl and to buy his ward a title in the bargain that he scarcely troubled to haggle over the terms. I will take her money, and I will give her my name, and if fortune is kind, she will keep quiet and keep to her figures, and I shall hardly be obliged to look at her from 1 month to the next." "A cold way to speak of your own Duchess," Soodley observed, though he was plainly still smiling as he said it. "She will never know the difference," the Duke answered. "Girls of that stamp do not expect to be loved. They expect to be useful and grateful for the chance of it. I mean to let her be exactly as useful as she pleases, and not 1 degree more. Now fill my glass and deal, and let us speak of something that does not bore me." There was the small, bright sound of wine poured against crystal, and a murmur of men settling back to their cards, and the matter was closed. To the 3 of them it had been nothing at all. A few idle words about a plain girl, spoken and forgotten before the next hand was so much as dealt. Sidney stood in the dark and did not move. She was aware of very strange things. She was aware of the cracked stick of her mother's fan pressing hard into her palm, so hard that later, undressing, she would find the small red mark of it printed into her skin. She was aware that her eyes were dry, perfectly and entirely dry, and that this surprised her more than anything, because surely a woman who had just heard herself named a face for adding sums, a woman useful and dull and never in her life to be loved, surely such a woman ought to weep. She waited for the tears the way one waits at a window for rain that has been long promised in the clouds. They did not come. What came instead, rising slowly up through the cold, was something she had no name for at first, and then did. It was clarity. It was the sensation of a badly kept ledger suddenly balancing. Every folded and hidden thing had come open at once, there in the dark. Desperate. He was desperate, ruined, drowning. Old Crail came to me near enough upon his knees, so very eager to be rid of the girl. Her guardian had not arranged a brilliant match for his poor plain ward out of any duty or any care. He had been eager, eager past all sense and all bargaining, to be rid of her and to bury her deep beneath a duke's grand old name. And a man was only ever that desperate to hand a thing away when it could still, if kept, be made to speak against him. She thought of her father's fortune, the accounts of which she had never once in 3 years been permitted so much as to glimpse. She thought of money the way her father had taught her to think of it, as a thing that was never truly still, that flowed and pooled and slipped away through narrow gaps a careless eye would slide right over. She thought of Creel's graciousness, and how graciousness in that man had always been the mask of fear. And she understood, standing alone in the dark outside the laughing room, that the Duke of Corvain believed with his whole heart that he was marrying a plain and useful girl who would keep to her figures and never know the difference between a marriage and a purchase. He was half right. She would certainly keep to her figures. He simply had not the faintest idea in the world what she could do with them. Down the corridor, the card-room door swung wider, and the Duke came out alone, still half smiling at some last remark, drawing his gloves on over his long fingers. He walked directly past the shadowed alcove where she stood pressed against the cold paneling, so near that she might have reached out and touched his sleeve, and he did not see her at all. He saw nothing. He went back toward the light and the music and the wasted violins, a man well pleased with his evening's work, and he never once knew that his future Duchess stood in the dark at his back, watching him go, having heard every single word. Sidonie did not go home and weep into her pillow. She smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin, and walked back into the ball. It was, she thought long afterward, the strangest walk of her whole life, that short passage out of the dark corridor and into the blazing heart of the ballroom. She carried the Duke's words inside her like a stone swallowed whole, cold and heavy, and entirely her own. And she smiled at Lady Vauncey across the room, and she accepted a small glass of ratafia she had no intention of drinking. And she was, to every eye in that glittering place, exactly the creature they had all agreed she was. A plain, quiet, useful girl, grateful past speaking to have been noticed by a duke. She had spent 3 years under Creel's roof learning to wear a face that gave away nothing at all of what moved behind it. Tonight, for the first time, she was grateful for every cold hour of that grim schooling. Not one soul in that room could have guessed that the dull banker's daughter was, behind her modest and downcast eyes, doing sums. Mr. Creel found her near the musicians. "You are flushed," he said, examining her the way he examined a coin he half suspected of being clipped. "You have not been making a spectacle of yourself." "No, Mr. Creel. I have only been admiring the room." "Good. The Duke has gone into his cards and will not trouble himself further with you tonight, which is as well, for you have nothing to say that would improve his opinion. You have made no blunders that have reached my ears." He said it as though it were high praise, and perhaps, in the meanness of his mind, it was. "The contracts will be signed within the fortnight. You will be a duchess by the first frost of the year. There are girls of 10 times your blood who would weep with plain envy to stand exactly where you are standing now." "I know it," Sidonie said, and lowered her lashes, and let him believe the color high in her cheeks was gratitude, and not the thing it truly was. Behind those modest lashes she was watching him with a new and terrible attention. "Within the fortnight, by the first frost." Old Creel came to me near enough upon his knees, so eager to be rid of the girl. She laid the two things side by side in her mind, the Duke's careless, drunken words and her guardian's careful, sober haste, and where the two of them touched, a picture began to assemble itself that she liked less and less the longer she looked at it. Why should a fortnight matter to him? Why a frost? Why a season? A guardian who had truly arranged a splendid marriage for his ward might take his ease over it, might stretch the pleasant business out across a whole winter of dinners and fittings and small important errands, might enjoy the reflected glow of it. Creel was doing the opposite of all that. Creel was hurrying, and hurrying hard. And a man only hurries to close a door when he is afraid of what will be seen through it before it swings shut. That night she lay awake a long while in her narrow bed, dry-eyed, not weeping, only thinking, turning the pieces. She thought of her father, 3 years dead, and of the counting house on Threadneedle Street with his good name still painted above the door, run now by Crail and shut against her as tight as a strong box. She thought of how she had never once, in 3 whole years, been shown a single page of the accounts of her own inheritance. She had asked, in the very beginning, when she was still foolish enough to ask for things. Crail had told her coldly that such matters were no concern of a maiden's, and had not spoken a word to her for a full week after, so that she had learned, as one learns to avoid a hot stove, not to ask again. But she had not forgotten how to read a ledger. She had only been forbidden the ledgers themselves, and she knew now, lying there in the dark with her plan quietly building itself, exactly whom she needed to find. There had been a clerk, her father's oldest and most trusted man, a spare gray soul named Tobias Wren, who had lifted her onto the tall stool when she was very small and slid the coins across the felt for her to count. Wren had loved her father like a brother. Wren had been turned out of the counting house within a single month of the funeral, and Sidonie had always wondered, in some idle back room of her mind, why the most honest man in the whole building should have been the very first one that Crail dismissed. She thought now that she was beginning at last to understand why. Sidonie rose before the maids, in the thin gray hour before dawn, and sat at the little writing desk beneath her window, and by the light of a single guttering candle, she wrote a short letter in a hand so plain and careful it might have belonged to any servant. She did not sign her name to it. She knew where Wren lodged, or where he had lodged a year ago. Her father had once sent her with a basket of physic and broth when the old man lay ill of a winter. She addressed it, and folded it, and sealed it with a plain wafer, and she thought, as she pressed it down, that this small folded square of paper was the very first free act of her entire grown life. Then she blew out the candle and sat quite still in the dark, calm as still water, and waited for the household to wake so that she might contrive some way to have her letter carried out in secret. She did not yet know that Crail had long since given the footmen their standing orders concerning her, nor that the very first move she made toward her own freedom would come within a hair of undoing her before she had rightly begun. The footman took her letter and bowed to her very civilly and carried it directly and without a moment's hesitation to Mr. Crail. She learned of it an hour later, when she was summoned down to his study. He sat behind the wide leather-topped desk that had once been her father's, and her small unsigned letter lay open and smoothed flat upon the blotter before him. And Sidonie understood in one single glance that she had made the first true mistake of her campaign, and that she could not, on her life, afford to make a second. "A curious little thing," Crail said very softly, which was always far worse in him than shouting. "A letter, in a hand I do not know, addressed to a clerk I dismissed for cause 3 years since, and brought to me, as all things in this house are brought to me, by a loyal servant who knows where his bread is buttered." He raised his eyes to hers. "Now what possible business, I wonder, could my quiet little ward have with the likes of Tobias Wren?" Everything in Sidonie wanted to draw inward, to go still and small and frightened, the old animal habit of 3 long years. Instead, she did the far harder thing. She let her eyes fill with tears, which was not difficult, for she was frightened in truth, and she let her voice tremble as she spoke. "I heard the old man was ailing, and destitute," she said, and let a tear spill and shine on her cheek. "Papa was so fond of him once. I only thought that before I am a duchess, and it is no longer thought seemly for me to do such small kind things, I might send him a little money, quietly. I did not sign it because I was ashamed, and did not wish you to think me foolish and soft and sentimental." She pressed her mother's fan to her lips as though to steady them. "I am so sorry, Mr. Crail. I know you think me a child." She watched, with the cold attention she kept always hidden, as the suspicion in his heavy face loosened by slow degrees into something far more comfortable to him, into contempt. And contempt was precisely what she wanted from him, for a man who holds you in contempt soon grows careless and stops watching you closely. He believed, as they all believed, in the plain, soft, foolish, useful girl. Every single one of them believed in her. She was beginning to understand at last what a rare and quiet weapon that belief might be made into. Sentiment. Crail said, and there was relief buried deep beneath his scorn, a relief so plain to her practiced eye that it told her more than a signed confession could have. He had feared for one moment something else entirely. You will send him nothing at all. He is a bitter, thieving old liar who was justly turned out, and you will not think of him again, nor speak his name in this house. Do you understand me? He fed her letter to the small fire in the grate and watched it blacken. You are dismissed. Go up and rest your eyes. A duke does not want a bride with a blotched face. She went, and that same afternoon, when Crail had ridden out upon some business of his own, Sidonie put on her very plainest cloak, the drab brown one, and she walked out of the front door of the house upon her own 2 feet. It had occurred to her, lying awake, that a woman who is watched for letters is very often not watched at all for footsteps. She made her way through the wet gray streets, keeping to the crowds, doubling once through a churchyard to be certain no one followed, until she came at last to the narrow lodging by a chandler's shop where Tobias Wren still lived. He knew her the instant he opened the door. The old clerk's eyes, pale and rheumy with his years, filled slowly with tears, and he put out one knotted hand as if to be sure she was real. Miss Sidonie, he whispered, Lord above us, you have your father's very look about the eyes. I would have known you in a crowd of 1,000. She told him everything. It was the largest risk of her life, and she knew it for one as she spoke. But she had weighed it out in the long dark hours and had decided that a woman with no allies at all in the world is already as good as lost. She told him of the marriage arranged over her head, and of the words she had heard through a door at the ball, and of Crail's strange feverish haste to see her wed. The old man listened without once interrupting, his knotted hands folded upon his knee, his head bowed, and when at last she had finished he was silent for a long, long moment. Your father, Wren said at last, and his voice had gone rough, was the cleverest man that I ever served in 50 years of service, and he did not trust Hollis Crail so far as he could have thrown the counting-house at him, brick by brick. In his last year of life he grew very quiet with me, quieter than was ever his wont. He was about some business he did not set down in the common books, and he had me help him at it in the evenings, with the shutters closed, and he made me swear a solemn oath to hold my tongue about all of it until you were grown and married well and safe. The old man rose stiffly and crossed to his cot, and from beneath a loose board in the floor he drew out a small locked box, and from within the box a bundle of papers, tied about with faded pink tape. He gave me these to keep against the worst. He said to me, Wren, old friend, if it should ever go ill for my girl, then she is to have these, and no other soul alive. I have kept them safe 3 years, waiting on a way to put them into your hands that Crail did not hold the key to. Sidonie untied the faded tape with fingers that would not quite hold steady, and she spread the papers out across the old clerk's scarred table, and she bent to read them by the failing gray light of the window. And slowly, page by careful page, the whole cold truth of the thing assembled itself before her eyes. In the last year of his life, her father had done a quiet and altogether extraordinary thing. He had gone secretly about the business of buying up debt. Not any debt that came to hand. He had bought the mortgages, and the notes, and the promissory bonds of one single great and failing estate, buying them up wherever in the kingdom they were held, in London and in the country both, patiently, quietly, through agents who did not know one another, until he owned very nearly the whole of them. She turned to the final page, to learn the name of the estate whose entire ruin her father had gathered so carefully into his own 2 hands, and there she stopped and forgot to breathe. Corvain. Every acre, every stone, every last debt and mortgage of the ancient dukedom of Corvain was owned, through her dead father's estate, by her. For a long moment Sidonie could only sit and look at the papers, while the sheer enormity of the thing turned slowly over in the dim little room. The man who had laughed at her through a card-room door, the man who had named her a face for adding sums and meant to spend her fortune and never trouble to look at her, that man did not own the very ground he stood upon. She did. Through her father's patient secret foresight, the whole of Corvain, house and land and name, hung entirely upon her word. The Duke believed to his bones that he was marrying her fortune in order to save his house. He had not the smallest notion that her fortune already held his house closed in its fist. "But why?" she whispered at last. Why in the world would Papa do such a thing? He never so much as met the Duke. He had no quarrel with the man, no dealings with him. "He did not do it against the Duke, Miss Sidoni," Wren said very gently. "He did it for you. Only ever for you. Your father knew that he was ailing, knew it long before the end. He knew he was to leave you a great fortune, and no living protector in the world but Hollis Crail, whom he did not trust, and he knew he could not alter so much as a line of his will without Crail coming to hear of it, for Crail was his partner and had eyes in every ledger. So he built you a second fortune that Crail knew nothing whatever about, and he hid it where no thief would ever think to dig for it, inside the ruin of a great house. A strong box no robber would trouble to break open, for who on earth would look for a treasure buried at the bottom of a bankruptcy? He meant it for a wall to stand around you and keep you safe." The old man's voice broke. He could never in his life have dreamed it would become the very house that they would sell you into. She understood him then, wholly, and the understanding was almost too vast a thing to hold in her two hands at once. But hard upon its heels came a second understanding, colder and sharper, that brought her head up with a snap. "Wren, listen to me. If I own all of this, if my father truly left me a great fortune besides, held safe in these papers, then where is it? Where is the rest of my inheritance, the plain money of it? And why does Crail drive me toward the altar as though I were a debt he must settle before the reckoning falls due?" She looked down again at the papers, and the old instinct woke in her, the one her father had given her, the one that could feel a single falsehood lying buried in a long row of honest-looking figures. "He is stealing from me. That is the thing he is so afraid I shall find. He has been quietly bleeding my inheritance these 3 years, and once I am a married woman, all that is mine becomes my husband's on the instant, by the plain law of the land, and my accounts pass out of my reach forever, into the careless hands of a duke who has already told the world he does not mean to look at them. The theft is buried past all finding. Crail walks free and rich. That is the fortnight. That is the frost. That is the whole of his haste." Wren's gray face had gone grayer still. "Then you must not marry the man, child. Not on any account. Not until we have the proof gathered and can bring Crail down before a magistrate." "No." Sidoni was already gathering the papers up again with quick and careful hands. "Think, Wren. If I refuse the match now, openly, Crail will simply have me declared hysterical, unfit, a girl of disordered nerves, and shut me away somewhere quiet where I can prove nothing to anyone, and he will have all the time in the wide world to burn his ledgers and hide his tracks clean. No, I must seem to go on exactly as I have. The plain, glad, grateful girl, walking meekly and thankfully toward her fine wedding." She tied the tape once more, her soft mouth set in a hard line. "And I have a little time yet before the frost. A wall my father built for me with the last strength of his life. I mean to learn how to stand up on top of it." She did not reach home again unseen. She had been so careful all that long afternoon, doubling through the churchyard, keeping to the crowds. And yet as she came once more into the good broad street where Crail's tall house stood, a fine, dark carriage was drawing up before the very door, and stepping down from it, unhurried, drawing off his riding gloves finger by finger, tall and entirely at his ease, was the Duke of Corvain himself, come to pay a call upon his bride. He turned at the small sound of her step upon the wet stones, and his eyes went over her all at once, the plain drab cloak, the mud on her hem, the bundle of papers she held clutched hard against her body beneath it, and for the very first time since she had heard his voice fall carelessly through a door, the Duke of Corvain truly looked at her. "Miss Callard," he said slowly, and something moved behind his eyes. "Out walking, alone and on foot in such weather, and carrying something you hold as though your very life were folded up inside it." A faint, cool, unwelcome curiosity kindled in his face. "How singular! I had been given quite clearly to understand that you never went anywhere at all." "Singular?" Sidoni repeated lightly, and made herself smile the small, grateful, downcast smile they all expected of her. "I walk out sometimes to carry a little broth to the poor of the parish, your grace. My guardian permits it. It is the one useful thing that a plain girl may do with an idle afternoon." She watched the word useful leave her own mouth and land upon him, and she watched nothing whatever stir in his face at the sound of it. And she thought, with a small cold satisfaction, "You do not even remember saying it. You do not remember that you weighed my whole worth in that one word and threw me away." It had cost him nothing. He had forgotten her before the next hand of cards was dealt. "Broth," said the Duke of Corvain, in a tone that made it plain he did not believe a word of it. "For the poor of the parish." He did not press the point. He was too well bred for that, or perhaps only too indifferent to trouble. But his eyes had gone once more to the bundle beneath her cloak, and she felt them there like a hand. He offered her his arm with cool courtesy to walk her the last few steps to her own door. And because Krail might well be watching from any window in the house, she laid her gloved fingers upon it. His arm beneath the fine wool was hard and warm and steady, and she hated with a sudden fierceness that she had noticed any of these things. At the door he paused and looked down at her and said unexpectedly, "You need not look at me quite as though I were about to strike you. I am told I have a forbidding manner. My brother had all the charm that was going in our family. I was left the accounts and the temper and the debts." Something crossed his face at the word brother, quick and bleak as a cloud shadow crossing a field, and was gone again before she could name it. "We are to be married within the month, Miss Callard. You may as well learn to be easy in my company. I do not bite the people who are of use to me." There it was once more, the whole of his contempt folded neatly into a single word, and he did not even hear himself say it. She lowered her eyes so that he should not see what stood in them. "No, your grace," she said. "I am quite sure that you do not." He mounted his carriage and was driven away, and Sidoni stood alone in the cold front hall with the bundle of papers pressed hard against her heart, deeply and unaccountably unsettled, and not at all for the reason she had expected to be. It was that flicker she had seen, that quick, bleak shadow at the word brother. She had heard it once before, that same note falling flat and tired beneath his laughter in the card-room. "My brother left me a mountain of debt dressed up as an inheritance." She had taken it that first night for a mere excuse, the whine of a wastrel. Now, having seen his face, she found herself wondering, against her own will, whether it might instead be a wound that had never healed. She did not want him to have a wound. It was a far simpler and cleaner thing to bring down a man who was only and wholly cruel. If Sidoni's story has taken hold of you, take one small moment now to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, so that you do not miss how a girl the whole world underestimated turns the tables upon every man who wronged her. Now, let us return to Corvain and to the house upon the hill. In the days that followed, admitted now as a betrothed woman through the great doors of the decaying house upon the hill, Sidoni began to see the true shape of the Duke's ruin with her own eyes, and it matched her father's careful papers to the very shilling. Corvain was magnificent, and Corvain was slowly dying. Whole wings of it stood shut up, cold and lightless, the furniture beneath grey Holland sheets like a country of ghosts. The servants were far too few, and had gone unpaid for months on end, and stage she slowly came to understand, out of nothing in the world but love, an old and stubborn loyalty to a family that had long since ceased to deserve it. And at the very heart of the great house, past a broken and neglected door, she found the orangery. It had been a place of rare beauty once, a long glass house full to the roof with green light. Now it was a wreck of cracked and fallen panes and dead brown trees and creeping green rot, and Sidoni stood alone in the middle of it a long while, in the failing afternoon light that fell through the broken glass, and felt something turn over in her own chest that she knew far too well. Here was a good and lovely thing, left to spoil and to die, only because no one living had found the will to tend it. "That was my mother's," said a low voice behind her, and she turned, and the Duke was standing in the ruined doorway, watching her stand among the wreckage, and his hard face, for once in all their brief acquaintance, was not cool at all. "No one comes here," he said. "The servants have got it into their heads that the place is unlucky. I confess I have not set foot inside it myself in 3 years." "Why not?" Sidoni asked him quietly. For a moment she believed he would only give her some smooth and easy nothing and go. Instead, to her surprise, he came into the ruined glass house, his boots crunching on the broken panes underfoot, and he looked up at the shattered roof and the gray sky beyond it as though the sight of it caused him a physical pain. "Because my mother tended it, with her own hands, every day of my boyhood," he said, "and then she died. And my father let it all go to ruin, out of grief, or out of spite against her memory, I never could tell which. And then my father died as well. And my elder brother had no interest under heaven in anything that did not run at a gallop or turn upon a card, and so it went on rotting. And then my brother died too, and left me the whole of this." He said it flatly, a man reciting a long and bitter bill of accounts. "I have buried every single soul who ever loved this house, Miss Callard, one after another, and I have not got the money left to me to mend so much as a single pane of its glass. So no, I do not come here. I find it a great deal easier to keep the door locked." Sidoni understood him then, wholly and completely, in a way that frightened her more than any of his cruelty had done, because she had kept her own doors locked for 3 long years for the very same reason, and knew exactly the cost of the keeping. She did not pity him. She had tasted, in her own life, the corrosive false kindness of pity, and she knew it for the slow poison that it was. So she did not soften her voice, nor reach for his arm, nor tell him that she was sorry for his losses. Instead, she walked the whole long length of the ruined orangery, slowly, looking at it the way she had been taught to look at a difficult ledger, seeing what was truly there beneath the wreckage. And she said at the end of it, "The frames are sound. I have looked at them. It is only the glass and the rot that are gone, and glass is a good deal cheaper than you would imagine, Your Grace, if only you do not buy it in London at a London price. The dead trees can be cleared and replaced within a single season. New tubs, young stock, a gardener who knows his craft." She turned to face him. "It is not beyond saving. Very little in this world is truly beyond saving, if only a person will trouble to look hard at what is actually there in front of them, instead of at what they long ago decided was there." He stared at her across the broken glass. Something had come up into his face that had not been in it before, a kind of startled, arrested attention, as though a chair he had sat in carelessly for years had of a sudden turned its head and spoken to him. "You speak of it," he said slowly, "like a woman of business." Careful, she told herself. Careful now. "My father was a banker, Your Grace. I heard a very great deal of practical talk at his knee as a child." She lowered her eyes modestly. "Forgive me. I forget myself and run on." "No." His voice had changed entirely. The cool drawl had gone out of it. Do not forget yourself. That is the first wholly honest thing I have heard fall from your lips since I met you." He came a slow step closer to her across the wreckage, and she made herself stand quite still and not retreat. "I have been unjust to you," he said, and the words came out of him with real difficulty, as though they were in a language he had never learned to speak. "Gravely unjust. I decided the whole of what you were before ever I troubled myself to find out one true thing about you. It was ill done of me." He drew a breath. "My name is Lucan. I should be glad if you would use it, when we are not in company. Lucan." She held his cruelty in one hand, and his given name in the other, and his dead mother's ruined garden all around her, and she said nothing at all for a moment, because the whole truth of it was climbing hot up her throat, and she did not dare, yet, to let a word of it escape. "I heard you. I heard every word you said. I own the very ground that you are standing upon." She swallowed it all down, hard. It was not the time. If she told him now, tonight, before Crail was caught and the proof was safe, she would lose the whole of it in an hour. "Thank you," she said instead very softly. "Lucan." And she saw, with a sharp pang that undid her more thoroughly than the whole of his cruelty had managed to do, that it was the first time in a great while that anyone in the world had said the man's given name aloud as though it belonged to a person worth the knowing. For one unguarded moment, standing there in his mother's dead garden, the Duke of Corvain looked painfully, achingly young. She turned away before her own face could betray the whole game, and so she did not see, but she distinctly heard the small, sharp sound of a single footstep in the corridor beyond the broken door. Someone had been standing out there in the passage. Someone had been listening to every word, and when she reached the doorway and looked quickly out, the long corridor stood empty, but a polished walking cane that she knew very well indeed had been left leaning, forgotten, against the paneled wall. Crail had been inside the house. He was gone by the time she reached the great hall, his carriage already no more than a smudge of dust upon the long drive, and Sidonie stood at the tall streaming windows with her heart beating hard and fast against her ribs, and made herself be still and think. What had he heard? Not the papers, thank God. The papers were sewn now into the very lining of her cloak, safe against her body. But he had stood in that corridor and heard the Duke of Corvain say, "My name is Lucan. I should be glad if you would use it." He had heard warmth, where he had bargained and paid for lifelong coldness. And a man like Hollis Crail, who had staked his whole safety upon a bride and a groom who would despise one another to the grave and never once trouble to look too closely into each other's affairs, such a man would find that small warmth more alarming than a drawn pistol. A husband who came, against all expectation, to care for his wife, was a husband who might one idle day take it into his head to look at her accounts. She was right to be afraid. Crail made his move the very next morning. A note came up to the Duke over his breakfast, and Sidonie was in the room when he broke the seal and read it, and she saw his jaw tighten hard. "Your guardian," he said, looking up at her, "writes to inform me that the marriage settlements are all drawn up and ready for signing, and that he wishes the wedding itself brought forward. To this day week." His mouth thinned to a hard line. "He writes that your health is delicate, that you are prone to nervous fancies and low spirits, and that the sooner you are safely wed and quietly settled in the country, the better it will be for your peace of mind. He writes of you," the Duke finished with distaste, "as though you were an invalid to be got safely off his hands before you turn troublesome." This day week, 7 days, and no more. He was sealing his secret up for good. He had heard enough through that broken door to frighten him badly, and now he was running headlong for the altar, exactly as she had always known in her bones he would, to get her married and her fortune and her accounts out of her reach forever, and his theft buried past all digging before anyone alive thought to take up a spade. And there was worse to come. That same afternoon, a ragged barefoot boy brought her a second letter, carried to her in secret past the footman, written in a spidery gray hand she knew at once. Tobias Wren. "Miss Sidonie," it read, "a man has been about my old lodging, asking after me, offering good coin for word of where I have gone and what it is I keep by me. I have moved myself to the place your father would remember, the sign of the anchor down by the river stairs. Come only if you are certain past doubt that you are not followed. He knows now that I hold something. He does not yet know what it is. Burn this." She read the little letter twice by the last of the window light, and then, obedient to it, she held the corner to her candle and watched old Wren's careful gray hand curl into black ash and fall. Her own hands, she noticed, were quite steady. That frightened her more, in a way, than shaking would have done, for she understood that she had passed some quiet threshold in herself and become a woman who did what needed doing and did not tremble at it. Crail was hunting the proof itself. If he found Wren, if he found the little locked box, if he burned the record of what her father had so carefully done, then she would own Corvain still, on paper. But she would never be able to prove Crail's theft to any court in the land. And worse than that, on the very day she married, Corvain and every last shilling of her fortune would pass by law to a husband, and Hollis Crail would walk free forever, rich upon her stolen inheritance and untouchable. She had days, perhaps only hours. Sidonie sat very still at the tall window as the light failed, and she did the coldest and hardest sum of her whole life. She could run tonight to Wren by the river stairs, and try to carry the proof to safety and risk with every step leading Krail's hired men directly to it. She could go to the Duke, here, now, and tell him the whole of the truth, and risk that a man who had openly married her only for her money would simply pocket that money on the wedding day and close ranks with Krail to keep it, and be rid of a troublesome wife into the bargain. Or she could do the one thing that frightened her past all the rest, which was to trust the small flicker she had seen twice now in a man's ruined face, and stake her whole future, her freedom, her life, upon the chance that the Duke of Corvain, who 3 weeks past had laughed at her through a door, had a better man buried somewhere inside him. She thought of his face when he spoke his dead mother's name. She thought of the way he had said, "It was ill done of me." She thought of "My name is Lucan." She rose from the window in the last of the light, and she went to find her husband-to-be, and she told him the truth, the whole of it, every word. She told him in the ruined orangery, for it was the one place in all that great house where no listening servant of Krail's would ever think to follow, and she left nothing out and softened nothing. She told him plainly that she had stood in the dark of the corridor at the Vauncy ball. She told him that she had heard every word of it, the plain face and the adding of sums and the not crossing of a street, the whole cold, careless speech, and she watched the color drain slowly out of his face as his own cruelty came back to him, unhurried, in her steady, quiet voice. Then, before he could speak, before he could stammer out whatever it is a man stammers when his very worst self is held up before his eyes in a clear glass, she told him the rest of it. She told him that her father had bought up his ruin. She drew the bundle of papers out from the lining of her cloak, and she spread them across a dry stone bench in the failing light, and she showed him, note by note, and mortgage by mortgage, and bond by bond, that the whole ancient dukedom of Corvain, root and branch and roof tree, belonged in law and in fact to her. And then she told him about Krail, the long, slow theft of her inheritance, the frantic, hurried wedding, the hunt, even now, for old Wren down by the river stairs. The Duke of Corvain sat down slowly upon a broken step, a man who had believed himself throughout to be the buyer in this bargain, and now understood all at once that he had been from the very first the thing that was bought and sold, and for a long moment he did not speak a word at all. "You have owned me," he said at last hoarsely, staring at the papers, "since before ever we two met. Every acre, every stone, the bed I sleep in, and I sat in that card room among my friends, and I called you a face for adding sums." He put his head down into his hands. "God forgive me. I called you useful." "Yes," Sidonie said. She did not spare him one grain of it. She had not come there to spare him. "Why?" He lifted his head, and his eyes were wretched. "Why are you telling me any of this? You hold the whole of it in your hand. You need only refuse the match, quietly, and let Krail's own greed and haste hang him, and keep your fortune, and keep my house, and never think of me or my name again so long as you live. Why in the name of heaven would you put the whole of it freely into my hands, when my hands are the very last in England that have earned the holding of it?" "Because I cannot save Wren alone, and the proof with him," Sidonie said simply. "Because the moment I move against Krail openly, as an unmarried woman and his ward, he will have me declared mad and shut away, and a duke he cannot so touch. And because," she said, and here her steady voice caught for the first time, "I have spent the whole of my life being weighed and dismissed and underestimated by clever, careless men, Lucan. And I have decided that I would rather, just once before I die, be proven right about one of them." She held his gaze without flinching. "So, prove me right, or prove me the greatest fool in England, but you must decide it now tonight, for we have until this day week and not 1 hour longer, and there is a great deal to be done." And the Duke of Corvain got to his feet. What he did in the days that remained before the appointed morning, Sidonie would carry in her heart for the rest of her natural life. He did not falter, and he did not once spare himself. That very night he called for his fastest horse and rode out in the dark and the wet, alone, all the long way to the river stairs, and he found the sign of the anchor, and he brought old Tobias Wren and his little locked box back to Corvain before dawn, under his own protection and his own roof, where Crail's hired men would not dare to come. He sent riders at first light for his own solicitor in the county town, and for a magistrate, a hard, honest old man named in no gossip column, whom he had known and trusted since boyhood. For 3 days the solicitor sat closeted with the papers and with Wren, and the false accounts were laid open beside the true, and the long, slow theft was traced out shilling by shilling until it could not be unseen. And on the appointed morning, when Mr. Hollis Crail arrived at Corvain in his very best black coat, with the marriage settlements folded proudly under his arm, expecting to find a frightened bride and a careless, indifferent groom, he was not shown into the chapel at all. He was shown into the great cold library of Corvain, where the Duke sat waiting behind a wide table with the grim old magistrate at his side, and every incriminating paper spread open in the light, and Sidonie Callard standing straight and quiet and unafraid beside her husband-to-be, her mother's cracked ivory fan folded in her steady hand. Crail saw the papers spread upon the table, and he stopped in the doorway as though he had walked full into a stone wall. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was still smooth as poured oil, but Sidonie, who had spent 3 years learning the sound of him, heard the fine crack running through it. "I confess I do not understand the meaning of this gathering. I have come here this morning for a wedding." "You have come for a reckoning," said the Duke. "Sit down, Mr. Crail." And Sidonie, watching the two men, understood at last the true and whole measure of the thing that Lucan had chosen. For everything spread upon that table gave the Duke of Corvain a reason to hold his tongue and do nothing. He had only to marry her that morning, as the whole world expected, and by the plain law of the land every note and every acre and every last stolen shilling would become his own within the hour, and he need never expose Crail at all, never confess how he had come to the truth, but only pocket a great fortune and a saved dukedom and let one old thief go quietly free, as the small price of his own lasting comfort. It was the easy road. It was paved smooth with the whole of her future, and she watched him, and he did not so much as turn his head to glance at it. "My betrothed," the Duke said, and his voice was very level and very cold, "has shown me certain accounts, the true accounts of her inheritance, which you have kept locked away from her these 3 years. My solicitor has spent 3 days with them now, and with the private records which the late Mr. Callard was wise enough, and knew you well enough, to leave in other and honester hands than yours." He laid one long finger flat upon the topmost paper. "You have robbed your own ward of the better part of £40,000, Mr. Crail, and you arranged this marriage not to raise her up, as you told the world, but to bury her, and your theft along with her, forever beneath a title too grand and too old for any soul to dare to question. The magistrate here has seen the whole of the proof. It is very far beyond your smoothing over now." Crail's heavy face went the color of cold tallow. His eyes darted from the Duke to the silent magistrate to the papers, and then, last of all, they came to rest upon Sidonie, upon the plain, quiet, useful girl he had never in 3 years troubled himself to watch with any care at all. And she looked back at him steadily, without a single tremor anywhere in her, and let him understand, slowly, exactly who it was that had brought him down to this. "You," he breathed. "It was you. It could not be. You are a child. You are a foolish girl who counts upon her fingers." "I am my father's daughter," Sidonie said quietly. "You ought to have looked a great deal closer, Mr. Crail. Clever men so very seldom do." They took him away within the hour. The £40,000, or such of it as still remained unspent, would be recovered in time by the courts. The balance would be paid out of the seizure of his own house and goods, and Hollis Crail would answer for his embezzlement before a judge, and Sidonie would never again, so long as she lived, be required to smile into that face and call herself grateful for her keep. When the great door had shut behind him at last, and the sound of the carriage wheels had faded away down the frozen drive, the library was very quiet indeed. The Duke turned to her, and for the first time she saw him wholly stripped of his armor, and standing there in his own grand cold library, he looked as uncertain as a boy. "It is done," he said. "You are free of him now, entirely. And you are free of me also, if that is your wish." He gestured toward the papers upon the table. "Corvain is yours. Your fortune is yours. I have already instructed my solicitor to draw up a settlement that places every acre and every shilling of it into a trust in your own name and Wren's, wholly beyond my reach forever, whether or not you ever choose to marry me. If you go with the whole of it, and I will not lift a hand to stand in your way, and I shall deserve every cold word that you will rightly think of me for the rest of my days." He drew a slow, unsteady breath. "I married you for your money, Sidonie. That is the plain truth, and I will not now dishonor us both by pretending otherwise, nor keep you bound to me by the very fortune I schemed to take. If you stay, from this day, you must stay only because you have freely chosen to, for no other reason under heaven." Sidonie looked a long moment at the man who had just given away, freely and forever, with his own hand, the single thing he had schemed and groveled and shamed himself to win, because he had discovered in himself that he would rather be a poor man freely chosen than a rich man merely endured. "You heard me say that I was plain," she said at last, quietly. "That night, in the card room. I remember every word of it," he said, and his voice was raw with the anguish of it. "I shall remember every word of it until the day I die." "Good," she said, and something in her chest, held clenched for 3 long years, began slowly to unclench. "Then we are even, you and I, for I heard every word of it too. And I find, Lucan, standing here, that I would a great deal rather build something true and lasting with the man you have shown yourself to be these last hard days, than rule over a great cold house all alone." She stepped forward, and she laid her mother's cracked ivory fan gently down upon the table between them, like a thing set down that need no longer be gripped. "I choose to stay." They were married 11 days later, and it was, the whole of society soon agreed, the single most extraordinary thing the entire season had produced. They were not married in London, before the staring eyes of the town, but in the small grey stone church at the edge of the Corvain estate, on a still cold morning with frost yet white in the hollows. Sidonie wore no borrowed finery and carried no hothouse flowers. She carried her mother's cracked ivory fan, and nothing else. The pews were filled not with peers and their painted wives, but with the tenants and the servants of Corvain, the very people who had gone unpaid for months and had stayed on out of love, and every one of them had come in their Sunday best to see the girl who had brought the old house back to life take the master's name. Old Wren wept openly through the whole of the service, and did not trouble to hide it. It was, Sidonie thought, looking down that small, crowded church, a far richer wedding than any cathedral in England could have given her. As for Hollis Crail, the courts were slow, but they were sure. He was stripped of his ill-got property to the last stick of furniture, and what could be recovered of the £40,000 was recovered and restored to her, and the man himself, who had spent his life trading upon the trust of better people, was given a long while behind stone walls in which to consider it. The gossip of the town could not for the life of it make sense of the tale, and gossip that cannot make sense of a thing grows frantic and inventive by turns. The banker's plain daughter, the odd, quiet little creature they had all so thoroughly enjoyed pricing and dismissing at the Vauncy ball, had not, it slowly and astonishingly emerged, been raised up by the great Duke of Corvain at all. Quite the reverse of it. It came out, no one could afterwards say precisely how, though old Wren may perhaps have let a word or two fall in the right places, that the young Duchess had brought the ancient and failing dukedom back single-handed from the very lip of ruin, that the whole estate had been saved by her fortune, and, more astonishing yet to every drawing-room in London, saved by her own clever hand upon its tangled accounts, and that his Grace, so far from being ashamed of any of it, had taken to speaking of his wife's head for figures with the open, unguarded pride of a man displaying a rare and priceless treasure to his guests. And the tale of Hollis Crail ran through the town like fire through a field of dry August grass. The trusted guardian, the sober pillar, the very picture of respectable dealing, exposed at a stroke as a common thief, and exposed by the very girl he had robbed for years and thought far too simple even to count upon her own fingers. Ladies who had laughed behind their painted fans at the Vaughancy ball now told the story at their own tables, as though they had always privately known there was a great deal more to Miss Callard than ever met the eye, as though they had said so at the time, to anyone who would listen. The first time the new Duchess of Corvain entered a London ballroom upon her husband's arm, the whole great room performed a small and telling miracle before her eyes. The very same women who had drawn their conversations closed against her a few short months before now opened them wide and warm at her approach. The very same Lady Vaughancy who had spoken so archly of matches made for other reasons now sank into a curtsy remarkably low, and hoped, with a great and sudden warmth, that her Grace was keeping quite well, and that the country air agreed with her. Sidoni inclined her head to the woman, gracious and cool and entirely unbothered, and thought, behind her calm eyes, of a plain frightened girl in sea-green silk who had once stood alone and unwanted at the very edge of this same glittering society while it pronounced her worthless to her face. She found, a little to her own surprise, that she felt no wish at all to punish any of them for it. That, she discovered, was the truest and sweetest victory of the whole affair, sweeter by far than any revenge. That their opinion of her, which had once been the entire weather of her days, the sun and the rain of her, now touched her no more than a spatter of rain touches the far side of a window-pane. Lord Carow, who had sat beside the Duke in that card-room and named her not so very dreadful, bowed to her stiffly across the room and could not bring himself to meet her eye. And close beside her, Sidoni felt her husband go suddenly very still, and then she heard him say, pleasantly, and just quietly enough that only the nearest few could catch the words, "You will find, Carow, that my wife has the finest understanding of any person now standing in this room, and by some distance the longest memory. I would be a great deal more careful, were I you in future, about what I said aloud through an open door." Carow's face went white, and he fled, and the Duchess of Corvain put her small gloved hand a little more firmly through the crook of her husband's arm, and felt him at once lay his own warm hand over it, holding it there, and understood, standing in the light and the music, that she was, for the very first time in the whole of her life, entirely and truly safe. Spring came late to Corvain that year, but in its own good time it came. The orangery was the very first thing that they set about mending, before a single shuttered wing was reopened, before the long drive was re-gravelled, or the leaking roof of the great hall made sound. Sidoni had insisted upon it, gently and immovably, and the Duke had not once argued the point. She thought privately that it was the only argument in their whole marriage she would ever win without needing to speak a word. The glaziers came out from the nearest town, where the glass was cheap and good, exactly as she had promised him it would be, and the rot was cut cleanly away, and the broken frames were scrubbed and made whole, and new young orange trees in great earthen tubs were carried in one by one through the mended door, until the long glass house stood filled once more, from end to end, with green and living light. She was standing in the midst of it one bright afternoon in April, in a plain gown, because she still liked plain gowns, and was now grand enough that no living soul would dare to call them anything but charming, going quietly over the estate's quarterly figures with a stub of pencil, when her husband came in from the fields with good mud on his boots and his dark hair blown about by the wind, and stood a moment in the doorway watching her at her work before she knew that he was there. "You are auditing me again," he said. "Someone must," said Sidoni, without troubling to look up from her column. "You have spent a truly indefensible sum this quarter upon young orange trees." "My wife," said the Duke, "has developed expensive tastes in ruins." He crossed the length of the sunlit glass house to her, and he took the pencil gently out of her fingers, and set it down upon the open ledger, and drew her up out of her chair and into the circle of his arms, and she went to him willingly, and rested her head against his chest, and heard beneath her cheek the steady, living, ordinary beat of his heart. Beyond the mended glass, the wide moors were turning green. She thought, as she found she often did now in quiet moments, of the girl who had stood frozen in the dark of a corridor at the Vaughancy ball, a cracked ivory fan clutched hard in one cold hand, listening to a man she had never truly met take apart her whole worth for the idle amusement of his friends. That girl had believed, with her whole breaking heart, that she was hearing the sentence passed upon the rest of her life. She had not known, could not have known, that she was in truth hearing only its beginning. She had not known that every cruel and careless word of it would become, in time, a single stone laid into the wall of her own strength, or that the very laughter that had been meant to break her would place into her hand, instead, the key to everything she had ever wanted and never once dared to ask for. "What are you thinking of?" the Duke asked her quietly, his lips against her hair. "Only that you should take a great deal more care what you say," she answered, "when you believe that no one at all is listening." She felt him smile against her hair. "I have learned my lesson well enough, I think. You hear everything, wife." "I do," said the Duchess of Corvain. "Every word." And she found, standing there at last in her dead mother's garden, brought back to green and living light, that she had come, in the end, to love the sound of it. If Sidonie's quiet triumph has left you cheering for her tonight, then you are exactly the sort of soul this channel was made for. There is nothing in all the world quite so satisfying as watching an underestimated woman take every cruel word ever used against her and forge it, patiently, into the very instrument of her own rise, with a proud and humbled Duke learning at long last how to deserve her. If you loved this story, please tap the like button, share it with anyone who treasures a brilliant heroine and a redemption that is truly earned, and subscribe and ring the bell so that you never miss another of our tales. Tell me in the comments below, what was the exact moment you knew that Crail had lost? I read every single one,